Give it a minute or two. So again, as we wait for more individuals to join, we have just want to have a couple disclaimers as we get started. So this is the webinar for the Equity Workforce Planning and Capacity Grants RFP that is open currently. We are recording this webinar, so if you do not wish to have yourself on video or have your voice recorded, please self-mute and please turn off your video camera. The slides and the recording of the webinar will be available after this. It will be posted to our website shortly after. And we'll give it one last minute and then we'll get started. Okay, so for those of you who just joined us, again, this is the MassCEC webinar on the Equity Workforce Planning and Capacity Grants RFP. The webinar is being recorded, so please self-mute yourself and turn off your video if you do not wish to be in the recording. We do have space later on in the webinar to ask questions. If you have questions that you don't want to forget, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we will, some of my teammates are on the call as well, so they will respond to you in the chat. And some of the questions we will potentially also voice in the webinar. So again, those of you who are just joining, please self-mute if possible. So the slides and the recording will be available after this. They'll be posted to the website soon after. Okay, so let's get started. If you can go to the agenda slide, please. So I'm Edward Shea. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Workforce Equity at MassCEC. My colleague, Camilla Bacalad, will also be presenting. She's the Program Coordinator. So this is a very quick, brief look at what we're going to go over today. As I mentioned, there are two spaces, as you can see in the agenda, where there'll be time for questions and answers. We'll start a little bit about the background of the grant, and then we will transition into how do you actually apply for the grant. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, please. Just some background about this opportunity. The RFP is the result of our Workforce Equity Fund. Our Workforce Equity Fund came into being in 2021 due to some legislation, which set forth $12 million annually to support diversifying and making the clean energy sector more equitable and inclusive. And the way that MassCEC has gone about doing that is to support minority and women-owned business enterprises that will be able to not only do business in the clean energy sector, but also hire. And then at the same time, support job training pipelines. So we are supporting those two. And then this is the third prong, which is supporting those organizations that are maybe not quite ready to apply to those two opportunities. They might need some support, but they have a great idea. And so we'll get into more depth about that in a moment. So the legislation itself covers several different requirements. So if you go to the next slide, please. So one of the targeted organizations are the minority and women-owned business enterprises, as mentioned. So by the legislation and the RFPs, that's defined as a business that is at least 51% owned and controlled by minorities or women principals. That could be either on the board or actually within their executive team. To qualify for our RFPs, they have to be in Massachusetts or at least have staff in Massachusetts. And they do not have to be MWBE certified by the state, so long as they meet the qualifications of being an MWBE in the eyes of SDO or potentially in one of the other certifying bodies that's recognized in the state. And so with that, next slide, please. In addition to the MWBEs, we are supporting specific populations of individuals. Individuals who live in environmental justice neighborhoods. Those are the neighborhoods which are disproportionately impacted by climate change. You can see the list here, the bullets of, what's legislated as the EJ neighborhood. A lot of it has to do with the median household income, whether the population is predominantly minority, language proficiency, or a combination of some of those different factors. In addition to that, we are supporting members of federally recognized or state acknowledged tribes, current or former fossil fuel workers transitioning into the clean energy sector, or members of underrepresented communities in the clean energy workforce, which is a pretty big catch also. If you can make a use case, if you can point to stats saying, for example, that female veterans are underrepresented in the clean energy sector, that would be one example, or certain ethnic populations, and so on and so forth. So moving forward, in addition to the MWBs and those target populations, to qualify for one of our grants, your grant purpose, the targeted program has to be putting individuals or businesses into 4 targeted climate critical sectors. So you can see the pictures here, which represents each of those sectors. Net zero grid, which is solar, microgrids, and other transmissions. Electrification of buildings and retrofits. Offshore wind, and then transportation, which includes EV infrastructure, electric bikes, and other forms of transportation. You can see here on the green box a call out, which will tell you the page number to refer to in the RFP if you forget from this webinar or need to refer back. That tells you which sectors and also which populations you need to be supporting or targeting. So next slide, please. Some quick examples just to make it a little bit more concrete. Some MWBs, there's a lot of different examples, engineering firms, consultants. I think the ones that we should highlight though are the trades type of MWBs, because a lot of people are not aware that the clean energy work is very trade driven currently. So electrical contractors, sole proprietors that are doing constructions and building and weatherization, those are all clean energy MWBEs out there doing the work. In addition, we also want to call out groups that are doing sort of the supportive stuff like customer service, call centers, stuff like that. Those are still qualified as MWBEs so long as they're doing work in the clean energy sector. Next slide, please. Oop, is it? Oh, there we go. Okay. Target occupations. Sorry, the screen changed without me realizing it. So target occupations, if you're doing job training as opposed to supporting MWBEs directly, as I mentioned, very trades heavy right now. There is a clear need for construction labor, electricians, but again, you have the engineers, the consultants, sales reps, customer service. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. We do have a needs assessment that will be coming out soon, and that will give some clear stats on which different occupations have highest need. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Next slide, please. So I think my colleague Camilla is going to be taking over from here.
Okay. Thank you, Edward. So as Edward mentioned before, we recently released the Equity Workforce Planning and Capacity Grants, and you can find the link on the QR code here, and someone will also be putting the link in the chat. So for the Planning and Capacity Grants, we have $551,500 total available funding. We are accepting applications on a rolling basis, but we do have priority reading dates, and we will discuss more on that on the later slides. So the purpose of the planning and capacity grants is to develop an implementation plan to your workforce training program or minority and women-owned business support program, or add key capacity for your existing workforce training program or minority women-owned business support programming. And the purpose of these grants is to expand access to workforce opportunities, whether that's feeding people into climate critical occupations or helping businesses into the climate critical fields. Next slide, please. So the eligibility requirements for these grants are shown here. So we are accepting lead applicants from community-based organizations, educational institutions, and for-profit entities, including training companies, trade association, unions, and other coalitions of businesses. And we are also accepting lead applicants from federally recognized and state acknowledged tribes, workforce development organizations, and workforce investment boards and mass hire organizations. Um, Even though we are looking for a lead applicant in this set of grants, we do strongly encourage partnerships in order to deliver a comprehensive program for participants. But we do want to note that one party that meet this eligibility criteria should take on the role of leading the application team in order to administer the contract for these grants. An additional criteria for the lead applicant is to have a Massachusetts-based office or staffing. We do also ask that the organization that is applying can produce a certificate of good standing from the Massachusetts Department of Revenue if you are awarded this grant in order to move forward with the contracting process. Next slide, please. For the planning and capacity grants, we will now explain the main difference between these two set of grants. So for the planning grants, the purpose is to plan a workforce training program or an MWBE support program. So the planning grants have an award range of $20,000 to $50,000. And this set of grants are the activities in the planning grants will occur during a 6 or 12-month award period. And the purpose of the planning grants is to solidify the elements of your training or MWBE support program prior to implementation. So in the planning grants, we do provide a technical assistance in order for you to develop an implementation plan that you can apply to MassCEC's own implementation grants or other funding sources. For the capacity grants, the award range are within $30,000 to $150,000, and the activities occurring in the capacity grants will be held in 1 or 2 year award periods. And the purpose of the capacity grants is to build in-house capabilities. So that could be, building in-house staff dedicating to your existing programming, or if you already have an existing programming and you already have the elements in order to implement it, but you just need some funding in order to get the right resources or get the right staff time in order to fully implement that program. You may apply to the capacity grants in order to successfully deliver that program. And these are some eligible funding uses for the planning grants and the capacity grants. So the planning grants will be used if you need to identify partners for support services. So we did have planning grantees in the past year, and during their grant period, those grantees really took their time to develop those partnerships with other organizations that can help them successfully deliver their training or MWBE support program. The planning grants can also be used to identify or clarify their curriculum resources in their training program, and to also just map out their implementation schedule for their programming. And this grant can also be used to fund that dedicated staff time to planning out this program. And for the capacity grants, the main difference is that the capacity grants will be used to further expand existing programming. So it can be used towards curriculum development, towards your existing training program. And this can also be used to fund equipment and supplies that are needed to successfully deliver the program. And the capacity grants can also be used to fund that dedicated staff time to expand this programming. We do have a short list of items that are not eligible for funding for the planning and capacity grants. So general operating expenses such as, leasing a venue for your own organization will not be eligible. But if you are requesting funding to lease a venue for your training program specifically, then that would be eligible, but just general operating expenses will not be allowed. We also do not allow full tuition scholarships for training program participants, and 100% or nearly entirely pass-through funding. So if you are requesting funding to administer grants to your participants in order for them to deliver their own projects, then that would not be an eligible use of the funding. And we also do not allow funding associated with costs with preparing this planning and capacity grant proposal. So in the application form for the planning and capacity grants, we do have 3 set of strands. So strand A is the career pathway training to climate critical occupation. So this strands are essentially pipelines that you are proposing in your application. So the career pathway training is meant to create that job training program to fill in the workforce gaps for climate critical occupations, and also creating opportunities for those target populations that we mentioned earlier in this presentation. Strand B is clean energy career awareness. So this strand is meant for career navigation programs, pre-apprenticeship programs, so things of that nature. And this trend is meant to expand the awareness of climate critical careers, since for the populations that we're trying to reach, they might not be aware that these opportunities exist. So we do allow for the planning and capacity grants and for organizations to have that opportunity to create programming for career awareness. Strand C is for business support services for MWBEs. So creating a program for MWBE firms to increase their revenue and support their back-end support services in order for them to flourish in the climate critical business fields.
So we're going to open it up to Q&A now. Briefly, we do have another half of this presentation, which is covering how to apply. So right now we're open up to 2 or 3 questions on, eligibility and, applicable projects. I would encourage you, though, if you're trying to go over, say, a concept, to reserve that and come to one of the open office hours that's coming up, because that's a better space to discuss a concept as opposed to questions about the actual RFP solicitation. I want to do 2 quick disclaimers before we do open it up. One, so we do cover equipment costs under the capacity grants. However, a application that is almost entirely equipment would probably not be very competitive. And in fact, it would be advised that you may want to hold that till fiscal year 24, when we believe there will be additional funds specifically for high equipment costs. So that's just one disclaimer. And then the other disclaimer would be when you are submitting an application for the high value subcontracts, again, you may have to be able to substantiate those subcontracts for the planning capacity. So with that, I'll open it up to your questions and answers. We can take some in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself at this point if you feel like voicing your question. And I see one that came through now. So Camilla, do you want to field that one?
Yes, so the question is from Jonathan Salzman. So can you expand more on the eligibility of for-profit businesses? What type of for-profit businesses would be eligible? For example, business networks. So a business network could be an association of clean energy businesses, renewable energy developers, and a network of a coalition of clean energy businesses that can support this kind of programming.
I would also add that we also welcome workforce development for profits that don't have experience necessarily in clean energy, but are trying to pivot into clean energy. So there are like training orgs out there that are for profit, or post-secondary institutions, for example, that may be considered for profit. So I see a question. Does computers, hardware, software fall under equipment as far as eligibility is concerned? So my response to that would be, it would be eligible so long as the hardware software is not intended primarily for general operating use and is directed for programming, to the benefit of the participants of the program. But again, if the grant is almost entirely designed for equipment costs, it may not be competitive in this round. But if you were to apply in fiscal year 24, we expect funds to be more dedicated towards equipment. We have space for one more question before we move on. Does anyone have there we go, let's see. So the question is a private company working in clean energy eligible to apply for this grant to raise awareness about renewable energy in target populations? So broadly speaking, yes. Career awareness is one of the strands that Camilla mentioned earlier, but to be clear, this is a workforce driven grant, meaning if you're just raising awareness in general about clean energy, for example, the ability to weatherize or opportunities to get subsidies, and the response would be that would not be that competitive because it's not workforce specific. Our goal for this equity fund is to increase the diversity and equity inclusion in the workforce in the clean energy sector, and not just the general awareness about renewable energy. We do have other opportunities at MassCEC for that as well, though. So I would advise you to take a look at the MassCEC website and look at, for example, we have the Empower Fund, which is designed for awareness in particular. So that's one option. So I do see a clarifying question before we move on. So software that is targeted at clean energy workforce development would be eligible. But again, it would have to be competitive. The application could not be entirely about the development of the software. And again, the software and equipment, those sort of equipment costs might be better reserved for the upcoming anticipated funds that are designed more specifically for equipment. So with that, let's move on. So let's talk a little bit about what we're looking for, since we already this is a good segue into it. So if you look at page 14 of the RFP document when you download it, that would cover this chart here. So I'll just hit the kind of high points here. So going back to the idea about for-profit companies, it's not whether you have experience in clean energy or if you have experience in workforce. We're going to look at it reasonably from either perspective, but also whether you have a track record in that particular realm in the region. For example, if your company or your nonprofit has not really worked in the Massachusetts region, to be competitive, we really strongly suggest you bring on a partner that's very experienced in the Massachusetts region, for example. Target occupations and populations, we went over that list of eligible populations and occupations. So we'll be looking at whether you're adhering to those. If you apply for a grant that doesn't cover one of those, it's unlikely that your grant would be awarded. The concept. So since this is planning and capacity, we recognize that you may not have all the details in place. You may not have all the components worked out. So what we'll be looking at is whether you have a good basic idea and whether you do acknowledge, the kind of steps you may have to take, the obstacles you may be facing to reach that eventual plan or that endpoint program. Commitment to maximizing partnerships, resources, and TA. So as was mentioned earlier, part of the benefit of getting a grant from MassCEC is we do higher level technical assistance than you may be familiar with or may have experienced through other grant makers. We are very much invested in growing the clean energy sector and the workforce in the clean energy sector. And so we provide through our staff and occasionally through third-party subcontractors, direct support in helping make sure you're successful. So once you're an awardee, you will have access to communities of practice. You'll have access to regular check-ins and advice from MassCEC. And so that's a big benefit to this. Diversity of approaches. We are looking at whether you're coming to the table, again, accounting for the DEI angle of the grant and whether you're targeting, a gap that we see, because we do have existing grantees, but they're not able to cover everything. So if you're coming to the table with something that is unique and different, that may actually increase your chances of being competitive. So next slide, please. So here's just a very general look at how this process goes. So you're already doing part of it here. You're attending the webinar. As I mentioned earlier, we have office hours coming up. So those office hours are a good space for you to discuss sorry, I misclicked that, Janelle, don't ignore that. Are good opportunities for you to come in and field your concepts and to talk about, whether your potential concept qualifies. Also during those sessions, we will actually refer you to potential partners. So there are opportunities on our website to sign up for lists of partners. So if you're coming in with a concept, but you may be lacking in a certain space and you recognize that, we are there to help you network. In addition, you're able to field questions after this webinar and after the office hours through the workforce@masscec.com email. So send your questions there, and then we will regularly post questions and answers that are relevant to the planning and capacity grant website. And so the final step, obviously, is submitting all the forms. The deadline for all the forms is right before midnight on June 30th of 2023. Make sure you put the correct title in the email. And in addition to that, you'll see in the application forms that there are fairly clear instructions about word counts, attachments, and if you fail to recognize those instructions and adhere to them, you may be disqualified. So going on to the schedule, I believe is the next slide. Actually, sorry, this is just to reinforce. These are the attachments that you will have to include in your application packet. If you're missing any of these, you may be disqualified or may not be considered or be less competitive. And we will not take additional attachments. So please do not send us, pitch documents. Please do not send us flyers. That said, in the attachment 2, which is the main form that you'll see that you have to fill out, it is a fillable form. You are welcome to paste in pictures of charts or other graphics, but please mindfully reduce the word count to be responsive to the number of words or data that's in those charts or pictures that you paste in. So moving on to the next slide, one thing that some of you who may have been in previous grant cohorts will see that's different is that we do require a very clear budget this time around. In the past, plan grants, we kind of stuck to a stock budget, but this time around, we were asking you to fill in attachment 3, which has a narrative about what you're using your funds for, does allow for some fringe and indirect references. And again, come to office hours, and if you have trouble with budgeting, we can discuss there a little bit. Please take a look at the form, and if you have any questions about the form, send to the workforce@masscec.com inbox to ask. Next slide also is a budget form, I believe. So in the budget, we have the general sort of cost, reimbursement, profit loss sort of setup, but then a subsequent second tab, which we've seen applicants miss in the past, is a milestone deliverable payment chart. So MassCEC runs off a milestone payments invoice system. So while we will be looking at your cost centers, we also need you to format where you think your costs will fall in the timeline, because we will be setting up, if you were to be awarded, a scope of work with you based on that timeline. So this is to make both of our lives easier in terms of you thinking in advance about how you may plan your work out in the timeline, and then how you may bill MassCEC if you were to be awarded. So moving on. So here's the schedule. As mentioned, we do have some office hours coming up. So please consider those times. Those are drop in, drop out times where you can just jump in whenever you feel comfortable during that hour, ask your questions, and then leave if you feel like you don't feel like listening to the other questions or answers. Those are open sessions. They will not be recorded. They're on Microsoft Teams, so they are virtual. And those hours, again, will not be recorded like this webinar, but relevant questions will be jotted down and posted to the website in the Q&A section. And again, these grants are rolling, meaning that the funds are available till expended. So there are 2 priority deadlines. You can see there, if you send in an application by April 26th, which is coming out quick, we will read them by May 1st. And then if you send by May 31st, we will read them by June 1st. However, as stated in the RFP solicitation, we still will not give you a response for at least 6 to 8 weeks after that timeline. That priority deadline is strictly to put you into the queue, since the money is first come, first serve. So moving forward. So this is just to reinforce office hours. And again, we're here to convene and to help you partner. We're not just here to grant you awards. Put your name, your organization, and your contact information in the chat if you would like to be added to the networking spreadsheet that's put on the website. And again, if you don't feel like doing it in this chat, you can send to the workforce@masscec.com email. So moving forward, one more last slide. I believe, yes. So right now we actually have the Clean Energy Internship Program with enrollment open. So this is a great way for you to get yourself or one of your partners an intern and have MassCEC cover a good chunk of the cost. You can see there the terms. It can be up to 12 weeks of the intern's work that's covered, and $18 per hour, or up to $8,460 per intern. Please visit masscec.com/employer for more details on the internship. It's a great way to also help get more individuals from diverse backgrounds into the clean energy sector by giving them some real, on the job, real world experience. So with that, I think that's all the slides we have today. I think we will go to our next Q&A section. So I see some contact info coming into the chat. Thank you for that. So again, we have a little bit of time here. We'll give some space for 3 to 5 questions at most. So does anyone feel like putting a question into the chat about the application process, or about the applicability, eligibility of your potential idea, and then any other questions that we can field at this time?
Edward, while we're waiting on questions, I just wanted to add one thing in that I'm not sure we've spoken to, which is that while these planning capacity grants are through this end of this fiscal year, we do anticipate having a similar opportunity starting again in FY24 with a refreshed set of funding. So while we've got the priority deadlines and this is first come, first serve for this space, we encourage you, if you're ready to apply. We would also say, if you're concerned that you're not ready, but you don't want to lose out on the opportunity, to be mindful that we don't anticipate that being a challenge.
And I did see one question go by, which was, whether we anticipate posting awards as we make them. We will be updating the website, on a rolling basis. And as mentioned, the sort of notifications to awardees will happen to 6 to 8 weeks after our priority reading deadlines. That said, for those of you who are not as familiar with working with a quasi-governmental agency, a lot of the awards have to be approved through a chain, which sometimes will delay the ability of us to make public announcements. So I will put that caveat on there of, we will inform the organization that receives the award on a timely 6 to 8 week window, but public announcements may be somewhat determinate on the grander approval process of the state. I see a question about the budget. So the question is about whether we need actual verified costs in the line item budget, or if estimates can be put in at a market rate. In particular, it looks like with reference to vendors, subcontractors. So that's a sort of a yes/no answer. We understand that at this stage, a lot of this is sort of a estimated budget. At the same time, we do ask, if you do put in a subcontract for greater than 50,000, especially, for example, on the capacity grants, that we do need some further granularity there, and we may request that you attach a further budget of how those subcontractor funds will be expended. So even in that case, they could be somewhat estimated, but we need some level of detail of understanding. So I don't see any other questions in the chat yet. I'll give some space. Anyone want to unmute themselves and ask, or paste something into the chat? So Camilla, I'm not sure, you mentioned that some had come in prior to the webinar. Were those all answered already, or are there any outstanding at this moment?
Yeah, so we have some questions that are still not answered yet. So that came through the Zoom registration sign in. So I can say those questions right now. And if you are the person or organization that submitted the question, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to, jump in and further expand on the question. So we received a question from Kara Oberg from the Ride Cafe. And the question is, would the bike mechanic hiring and training program be eligible for clean energy equity workforce programming, given biking is zero emissions? I run a bike repair and family travel shop and would love to build out this program with one of my mechanics.
So without further detail, the short answer to that would be, it depends. I think funding bike mechanics strictly might not be that competitive. However, we do fund transportation projects, and we do look favorably upon electric bikes, as we do run e-bike grants. So if the program were to include some element of electronic bikes, that could be more competitive.
Okay. Another question that we received is from Allison Zuckman from Built Environment Plus. So can the grant be used to support content development, program design, and expanded partnerships with instructors from Massachusetts-based MWBEs who will offer training with us?
Yeah, yes. I mean, generally speaking, again, without seeing the full concept, I would say that does sound like a favorable use of the funds. In fact, I think that's the primary use of this funds, which is to fully flesh out a plan that's not fully there, like to fill in the gaps, to find the partners, to solidify those MOUs. For those of you who have not had a chance to look at them, the implementation training RFP and the MWBE support grants, which are the implementation version of the MWBE grants, are, I believe, still on the website. So if you navigate to those RFPs and take a look at them, those would be the endpoint goals for these planning and capacity grants, to get you to the point where your plan is ready to turn around and respond to those RFPs and then stand up a program, or to submit to another state or local funding source like ComCore, OWD, EOWLD, or one of those larger funders, Bar Foundation, that fund the clean energy sector as well. So the short answer is yes.
Yeah, another question is from Greg Kaplitz from Community Work Services. So can an agency apply for multiple sources from MassCEC, and does it affect scoring?
So the answer to the first part is yes, as long as the applications are separate and distinct projects. And to clarify, that separate and distinct could include an expansion of an existing previously funded project, as long as that expansion is clearly a new part of the project. So like adding on upskilled curriculum beyond so for example, if someone's doing weatherization or HVAC training and they want to add on HVAC curriculum, that would be in a separate distinct expansion of the project. So the answer is yes. And then in terms of favorable scoring, generally speaking, as long as it's separate and distinct, it won't impact the scoring. Obviously it depends on whether the content of the actual application is reasonable and whether the amount being asked for is reasonable in context with everything else.
Okay. Another question is from Dave Machols from Advanced Vehicle Technology Group. They are asking if a company who is registered in New York that run classes throughout the Northeast and have personnel in Massachusetts can apply for this grant.
So before I answer that, I'll just put out a disclaimer to the group. If you have a question, feel free to interrupt. We're just going over these questions for the record since they were submitted prior to the webinar, but if you have a burning question now, we want to give you the time since we are live right now, so feel free to interrupt. So in response to that question, if they have personnel in Massachusetts and they're able to produce a certificate of good standing through DOR, then yes, they are eligible, even if their base is in, you mentioned, I think, New York. That said, there is, as you saw in the criterion, experience, and some of that experience is based on whether they have experience in Massachusetts, because we have to recognize that every region, every city, even every block might have different obstacles and experiences and lived experiences than a different one. So while we will look favorably on workforce experience in general, even if it's in New York, we advise that that organization try to find a local partner that has direct tendrils into whatever local neighborhoods they hope to service in Massachusetts. So with that, I'm going to give one last call for questions from the live crowd to see if we have any burning questions about the planning capacity grant. And one last call, and then we're going to close it up and give you guys back some time. Actually, I see someone unmuting. Do you have...
Edward, this is Chuck Coakley from Mass Hire NAMC organization. How soon before these slides will be available online? Do you have any idea?
I would say at least a week or so, just to give us time to get it up on the website.
Okay, and which is it? Just masscleanenergy.com?
MassCEC.com, and then if you look in the chat, there have been URLs pasted in. We can actually paste in if Stephanie or Camilla, you can paste in the direct link to the planning page. So Chuck, check the chat in a second and there'll be a direct link.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. There it is. The link just went in from Stephanie. So I see
Okay.
JC, you have your hand up. JC, you're muted if you're talking. Let's see, do I have to unmute you? Let's see.
Oh, hi. It's Natasha. I did not mean to have my hand up. Please forgive me.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I will give a little bit of airspace one last time. Does anyone have any last questions about the planning capacity RFP? And again, as a reminder, if you come up with a question after this webinar, you can feel free to email us at workforce@masscec.com, and we will respond to you directly, but also post question and answer on the website. Okay. So with that, we're going to end the webinar for today. Thank you for taking the time to come out. We look forward to seeing your applications, and feel free to reach out.